She's going to read us Matthew chapter 2, but I kind of give a little bit of context to the why behind this series, and even, I think, especially Matthew chapter 2. Before I jump into that, though, let me just say, if you're new to Narrate, especially if you're new since COVID, just recognizing, just had a conversation again this morning of so many people who are kind of trying to reemerge in a new community, having been in a place for months or even a year, and just trying to meet people and get connected and figure all that out. I'd love to meet with you, go for a walk, grab lunch, grab a beverage, whatever that looks like for you. So just would invite you to email me, or if you'd rather meet with one of the staff, I wouldn't blame you, and they also would love to meet with you. But we don't necessarily have a lot of programs and a lot of like, hey, let me give you my name and we'll just kind of plug you into all these things. We like to start from that. Let us get to know you, and then both our Sunday teams, which are instrumental in helping you get connected and serving with us, we can kind of help you find that fit, and at the same time, just connect and kind of do the networking that involves all of that. We're a small enough community that I think we can verbally kind of go like, oh, you should meet so-and-so and so-and-so, and so let us know if we can help you with that. And frankly, if you're not here since COVID, but also just kind of re-emerging and trying to put some pieces together, again, same invitation, would love to connect in any way. Where I want to go this morning is, I wonder if one of the gifts of COVID is this realization that we find ourselves asking the question, does what I do matter? And I don't know if you can relate to that at all, if that's been a part of this last year's experience for you, but just this sense of, does what I do matter? Like, does it really contribute? Does it really have staying power? And whether that's that you're 13 years old and you play soccer and go to school, or that's that you're a college student, or that's that you sell things on Amazon, or you're a doctor, or you're a nurse, or you're a stay-at-home parent in this season, I guess I think Matthew begins to speak to some of that tension. I know for me, and I don't want to put words in your mouth, but for me, as I'm reflecting on this last year, a big piece of that puzzle was dealing with this, what at times was kind of an ominous, dark question of, okay, so if that can go away that easily, did it ever matter in the first place? And in some respects, it feels like there's an advantage that I have because of what I do for a living, so to speak, but there's also a disadvantage because there's the sense of like, God, is this even what you had in mind? Are we being a community the way you had in mind? And there's this kind of looping question. And for me, for whatever it's worth to you as you wrestle with that, I think the realization that I've come to is part of the answer is yes. And the way I've been saying this to myself for months and recently to some friends is like we need people who pick up the garbage every day. And we need people who make us our coffee, and we need people who do our therapy, and we need people who teach our fourth graders math, and we need childcare providers, and we need state, like we need, unless you're like a drug dealer or a prostitute, I think we need all of it. And yet the tension, I think, is as much as it does matter today, like the way we evaluate a good meal isn't its ability to sustain us tomorrow or next week. Like the good and the bad is you can work really hard to provide a really important, really good meal, and 4 hours later, you need another meal, and especially if you're 16 and growing. And so for me, the other part of that tension is like part of the answer is yes, it matters, but I think where the angst comes from is the other part of the answer is it in some ways it doesn't, or it does, but tomorrow if you don't do it, you won't be missed for very long. If you're not the one teaching first graders how to read tomorrow, then we'll just find somebody else. And there is this realization of we're all pretty replaceable and replaceable pretty quickly. I mean, I've been thinking of it this way let's just say you spend 30 years of your life teaching English at Capitol High. I mean, on the one hand, you're there in many ways, I'm sure, because of the way you get to add value to people's lives and serve students and build relationships. And yet, when you retire, or if you retire, or a year later, hardly anybody will even remember that you were ever there. 10 years later, probably no one will ever remember that you taught English for 30 years of your life. We had this experience a few summers ago. I was in the backyard working. I can't remember what I was doing in the house, but someone knocked on the door, and so I did the classic introvert where I eavesdropped but didn't engage, and it was an elderly woman who, with her adult son or daughter, I forget which, came to the door, and she knocked on the door, and we lived like in a 30s era built home. And my wife answered the door, and she explained that her father had built the house, or had built, he was a dentist as I recall, had the house that we live in built, and she was wondering if she could come in and look around. She was in from out of town, She got into our living room and she pointed over to the couch and she said, "Can I sit over there?" And she walked over and she sat on the couch and she looked at my wife and she said, "My husband proposed to me, like sitting right here." And she had this moment, and there was aspects of it that were really special. It also put this other thing in perspective for me, where especially this last year, and probably many of you too, did a little bit or a lot of home remodel type of work. And there was this one time where my boys were tearing the shelving out of this kind of unfinished room in our basement, and I was dealing with some of the wood that was left from that. And I'm not a carpenter, but I was able to look at this stuff and go, and someone didn't just go buy something at Walmart. I mean, this was really well built. It's heavy fir wood, done with incredible precision. And I remember thinking, some other dude raised his family in this house, and they cared about the contents and the quality of it just as much as I do. And yet, I don't even know their name. I know nothing about their story. And so what I'm wondering, and we're going to come back to this in Matthew 2, but I'm wondering if part of the invitation of COVID is to adopt what I'm going to call a more humble view of ourselves and see things through this lens that I think the gospel's trying to bring them to us. Because to whatever extent what I've said is true and accurate, that on one hand, we need you to pick up the garbage tomorrow, we need you to teach first grade, but on the other hand, don't take yourself too seriously because you'll be easily replaced just like everybody else. To whatever extent that's true, the exact opposite is true of Jesus. Like 2,000 years later, we're still talking about his sermons. I mean, you hear your dad start the story and you're like, "Oh, I'm hearing this story again." We're still talking about these stories that Jesus told over and over. We're still wrestling with what was the invitation and how did he understand himself. And whether you're a Christ follower or not, almost nobody anymore debates whether or not he was a historical person. 2,000 years later, we're talking about this person, Jesus, who lived on a different continent in a different age. I mean, it's incredibly unlikely that we would be here in Helena, Montana in 2021 talking about Jesus of Nazareth who grew up in northern Galilee. And so I think what we're trying to do in this series is in some sense create a new on-ramp for those of you that have been around church for as long as you can remember to re-engage the story and go, why are we so mesmerized by this person? In another sense, if you're not anymore, or you used to be a Christ follower, or you're kind of thinking about it, you're intrigued, what I'm hoping is that this series is this chance to go, what is this Jesus all about? And so with that, Anna's going to read us Matthew chapter 2.
All right. In the time of King Herod, after Jesus was born in Bethlehem of Judea, wise men from the east came to Jerusalem asking, "Where is the child who has been born King of the Jews? For we have observed his star at its rising, and we have come to pay him homage." When King Herod heard this, he was frightened, and all Jerusalem with him. And calling together all the chief priests and scribes of the people, he inquired of them where the Messiah was to be born. They told him, "In Bethlehem of Judea, for so it has been written by the prophet. And you, Bethlehem, in the land of Judah, are by no means least among the rulers of Judah. For from you shall come a ruler who is to shepherd my people Israel." Then Herod secretly called for the wise men, and learned from them the exact time when the star had appeared. Then he sent them to Bethlehem, saying, "Go and search diligently for the child, and when you have found him, bring me word so that I may also go and pay him homage." When they heard the king, they set out, and there, ahead of them, went the star that they had seen at its rising, until it stopped over the place where the child was. When they saw that the star had stopped, they were overwhelmed with joy. On entering the house, they saw the child with Mary his mother, and they knelt down and paid him homage. Then, opening their treasure chests, they offered him gifts of gold, frankincense, and myrrh. And having been warned in a dream not to return to Herod, they left for their own country by another road. Now, after they had left, an angel of the Lord appeared to Joseph in a dream and said, "Get up, take the child and his mother, and flee to Egypt, and remain there until I tell you, for Herod is about to search for the child to destroy him." Then Joseph got up, took the child and his mother by night, and went to Egypt, and remained there until the death of Herod. This was to fulfill what had been spoken by the Lord through the prophet, "Out of Egypt I have called my son." When Herod saw that he had been tricked by the wise men, he was infuriated, and he sent and killed all the children in and around Bethlehem who were 2 years old or under, according to the time that he had learned from the wise men. Then was fulfilled what had been spoken through the prophet Jeremiah. A voice was heard in Ramah, wailing and loud lamentation, Rachel weeping for her children. She refused to be consoled, because they are no more. When Herod died, an angel of the Lord suddenly appeared in a dream to Joseph in Egypt and said, "Get up, take the child and his mother, and go to the land of Israel, for those who were seeking the child's life are dead." Then Joseph got up, took the child and his mother, and went to the land of Israel. But when he heard that Archelaus was ruling over Judea in place of his father Herod, he was afraid to go there, and after being warned in a dream, he went away to the district of Galilee. There he made his home in a town called Nazareth, so that what had been spoken through the prophets might be fulfilled. He will be called a Nazorian.
Nice job. Thanks, Anna. You can go this way if you want. Your family's over there. So there's a lot of nuances, and obviously some of you will know this if you're spending time in it. There are some resources on the mind map if you're really into all of the historical connections and the typology, and you can have a lot of fun with it. Here's the question that I guess I want to pose as kind of hovers over this chapter is what if part of what Matthew's trying to do, because remember what we said last week is we're going to try to attend to what Matthew the writer is doing and how he's uniquely telling the story. What if part of what Matthew is trying to do is contrast two kinds of leaders? Remember, Matthew's audience are Jewish people who, frankly, the cost of seeing Jesus as Messiah is very high. And he's writing to them in this season, and it seems like what he's doing, this is what we talked about last week, is he's trying to get their attention and going like, no, this guy's a big deal, and he's not a deviation from what we've done. He's not a departure from who we are. He's the culmination of it. And what if part of his point of persuasion, and we're going to see this in the next couple chapters really, is to say there's two kinds of leaders, and yet we all get to choose which kinds we want to follow. See, for us, Herod was a king. But in their world, he claimed to be king of the Jews. He was claiming to be the one in the line of David and Moses, these leaders who were the triumphant leaders of Israel. And yet for a first century Jewish people, and maybe you've spent some time studying Herod, if you're interested in it, he's an easy one to type just Herod the Great into the search function of your podcast app. And there's, because of Josephus and others, these first century historians, we actually have a lot of content on Herod the Great. But to say Herod's name, just to suffice it to say Herod's name to Matthew's Jewish audience would be akin to saying Hitler to some German people in, say, Berlin in 1947. I mean, it would have instantly brought with them, nobody would have needed to explain to them after that what Herod was like. And it seems like in part what Matthew might be trying to do here is to go, do you recall, are you aware of the kind of leader Herod is? Now, we've spent years ago, I spent a whole Sunday on Herod, but just by way of quick reminder, just a glance at Herod. More recently, I learned that some scholars are beginning to argue that Herod was the single most wealthy person in the history of the world, like relative to those around him, relative to other people's wealth, like beyond Bezos and those Elon Musk and those figures. They would say, no, Herod probably was the single most wealthy person in the history of the world. He was part of a family that controlled the spice trade in what we know is a very strategic region of the world. But we also know that when you have that much resource and power, it forces you to protect it. One rather famous or infamous story of Herod is one of his sons was leading a rebellion. And in order to squelch that rebellion, he publicly had his son's head placed in what we would call a vice, slowly closed, ultimately crushing his skull and killing him there, just to make his point. He was an Olympic gold medalist. He also had a lot of sexual encounters. There's good reason to believe that he actually died of STIs or sexually transmitted illnesses. And he knew when he was reaching the end that there would be a party upon his death, that the land would celebrate, and that bugged him. And so strategically, this also, I think, shows how strategic, though evil he was. He strategically had men from all over Israel arrested and then ordered that upon his death they should be executed, because his logic was, there's going to be mourning on the day that I die, and even if it's not over me, that's okay. There's not going to be a party. He also was paranoid. He actually wasn't an Israelite by origin. I think he was an Edomite. I didn't take the time to fact check that. It's been a while since I studied it. But he had a whole departure plan, a departure route should things get bad. One of those, and what we know is he built a series of palaces. One of them is called the Herodium. We have a picture here. The Herodium is actually in Bethlehem, so this is one of those typology things. Jesus was born where? So Jesus was born like on the steps of the Capitol building, so to speak. The Herodium is in Bethlehem. It's confusing, like is that a mountain that Herod built a palace on? Well, the archaeologists I've studied under or listened to, they argue, and this was also true when I was there, that it's less likely that this is a mountain that he turned into a palace. It's more likely that this is a mountain he had built and then had a palace built within it. So his power, he's this great architect. He had this ability to design things. Some of his Herodian stones on the Temple Mount, we still don't have a modern crane that could move them, and yet you can't fit a credit card between them. So he was an expert builder. He was pouring concrete underwater in the Mediterranean Sea in his era. If you go to the certain parts of the beach in Israel today, there's round pieces of white marble, just like rock, because there was so much white marble in some of his construction. I mean, the guy was an incredible builder, but the Herodium was about his safety. He knew that if things got bad, he would go from there to Masada and on out the south of Israel. It speaks to his opulence. You may remember there's a guy named Jesus who one time said, hey, if you have faith as small as a mustard seed, you could say to this mountain, be cast into the sea, and it'll be gone. And some people think, because when you stand on the Mount of Olives, we have that picture, that's the Herodium, and that's not from the Mount of Olives, but on a clear day, I was there once, on a clear day, standing on the Mount of Olives, looking at the Temple Mount over here, you can see the Herodium over there. There's this ominous thing. It came with all kinds of emotion and reminders of abuse, and he was a trigger, we might say. And what if part of what Matthew is doing is going, okay, so you've got that kind of leader, and then you've got this Christ, this Jesus, this one that I'm going to introduce you to in this book. And even with the ground we've covered, what is the contrast? Well, Herod, he compensated for his vulnerability by doing what? By killing sons, by building massive palaces, by making arrangements with Rome so that they would take care of one another. How did Jesus deal with his vulnerability? Well, ironically, he doubled down on it. He was born to these nobody parents. He was born in a barn, so to speak. When Herod was threatened by other leaders, he killed them, even if they were associated with other 2-year-old children. Jesus came as a child. There's this contrast that's happening over and over. What if Matthew's trying to bring that to attention? We know the gig. We've worked for different kinds of bosses and had different kinds of roommates and played for different kinds of coaches and had different kinds of friends. We understand that everybody brings a certain culture with them. And I think part of what Matthew's trying to do here is go, Jesus brings a different kind of culture. You choose. Let's play this game. I want to say a name, and you say out loud the first person that comes to mind. I would recommend that when I say anger, you don't say the person sitting next to you. But other than that, we're all going to do this simultaneously, right? Okay, so let's just say hardworking. Just say it out, everybody. Hardworking. Say somebody. Okay. This is hard. Was there caffeine in the coffee this morning, Hannah? Creative. Say it out loud. Say somebody else out. It's just going to be a mess. I'm not trying to listen to you. Musical. Athletic. Aaron Rodgers. Egotist. Aaron Rodgers. Just kidding. The one guy who does it, and I pick on him. Sorry, Christian. In Jesus' world, when you say leader, who comes to mind? Well, one of them, I think, is probably Herod. Who's the other one? Especially if you're Orthodox, especially if you're paying attention, especially if you're hopeful that you won't always have to follow Caesar. Who else comes to mind? It's Moses. We often think of David as kind of the culmination, but Moses was the culmination. And here's some typology stuff. What made Moses so adored? Well, what's his story? Well, he was born under a foreign king. He was born to a mother that was a slave, so she was at the very lowest rung of the ladder. In fact, she was so vulnerable, and this king was killing all the male Hebrew boys at this point, that she gave birth to him miraculously through the help of some midwives, and then stuck him in a wicker basket. That the Hebrew word there is stuck him in an ark, placed the ark in the Nile River. When I think of alligators and things like that, all I think of is Mufasa and alligators when I think of that. I don't know what the actual Nile is, but this baby stuck in a wicker basket in it doesn't seem particularly safe. Wasn't born in a barn, but was born in a river, kind of. He was scooped up by a woman who lived within Pharaoh's palace. The exact relationships is a little bit hard to figure out sometimes. He was raised in Pharaoh's palace. And then what's Moses' story? Well, at some point, he saw the plight of the Jewish people. He saw they were under bad leadership. He saw that they were under the thumb of someone who didn't really care about him. And what did he do? And this, I think, is especially important as we think about what was the Jewish mindset towards Jesus, or towards Moses in Jesus' day. Stephen, in the book of Acts, he goes beyond what the Hebrew Bible says when telling Moses' story, and he says, Moses, he forsook all the privileges of the Pharaoh's palace in order to lead a rebellion, in order to lead these people into freedom. Do you see what Matthew's doing here? He's going, you think this guy's amazing. Let me just show you Jesus is that and more. What if part of what he's trying to bring to mind is, what kind of leader do you follow? And what kind of leader do you want to follow? But if he's doing that, what if he's also contrasting two kinds of followers? And I think this is the personal piece. This is the okay, so what do I do with this? Because he's not just talking about Herod and Jesus, Herod and Moses. He's talking about specific followers. Verse 3 in the text, I think, is a really, really important one. When Herod heard this, King Herod, imagine how offensive that was to hear for a Jewish people. When King Herod heard this, he was disturbed, and all Jerusalem with him. Well, who's all Jerusalem? Quick history lesson. There's 5 major groups of people in Jesus' world, Jewish people. There's the Pharisees. They live in the north. They live in the Galilee. They're the country bumpkins, if you will. Their conviction was that if we follow the Torah perfectly, God will send his Messiah. There's the Zealots. Their approach was, we should just kill Romans. I mean, their approach was that we're just going to deal with this through violence and through military. They also mostly hung out in the north because that was their safe haven, and then when they had to, they would pop down into Jerusalem and knock a few Romans off. There was the Essenes. The Essenes were essentially a group of priests initially, as I understand it, who decided the temple was completely corrupt, that they were completely doing it wrong, and in a kind of Mennonite fashion, they decided that the whole culture was going to hell in a handbasket, and so they withdrew to a portion of Israel that nobody else wanted to live in. We call it Qumran, or next to the Dead Sea, and they started their own alternative society. That leaves 2 more groups. These are the 2 major groups that lived in Jerusalem. Who are they? They're the Sadducees, who were an extension of the Seleucids, which was this temple that these people that overthrew the temple and took it back about 100 or so years before this, but then they became corrupt. The Sadducees were the priesthood. And why were they the priests in Jerusalem? Well, because they worked a deal with Herod. If you wanted to be in charge of the temple and the religious system, you had to play fair with Herod, and that was the Sadducees. The 5th group, who also lived predominantly in this region, were the Herodians. Why do we call them that? Because they were Jewish people who found a way to make their Jewishness fit inside of the Roman lifestyle. So what's going on? So when he says all Jerusalem is disturbed, who's disturbed? And why are they disturbed? Because if you're a Sadducee, If you're a Herodian, if that's your party, if that's your culture, if that's your lifestyle, is it good news or bad news if Herod loses his power? Are you looking for your order to be disrupted? Are you looking for a different kind of life? Are you looking for a different kind of religion or expression of following God? So what if he's contrasting? There's 2 kinds of followers. There's Herod's followers. But then what would be the idealized followers? Who is Matthew trying to point our attention to? what if it's Mary and Joseph? What if what he's pointing us to, and this is, for me, it helps me deal with not only the times like, why did we move so quickly from Herod to these kids who are now parents of the Messiah, who now are running to Egypt and running back, so there's some typology there, there's some new Exodus stuff going on there, but what else is the story of Mary and Joseph about? What if it's about our spiritual expectations of God? What if it's about our getting to or not getting to define what the with God life actually looks like? What if Matthew's doing something there where he's reminding his people, there have been times when we've been on top, but are those the majority or are those the exception? What if Mary and Joseph are a type of answering the question, because we said Matthew 1 is all about God's desire to be with us. Wouldn't a reasonable question be, well, what does with us look like? Like, what can we expect our lives to look like if God is with us? And how much of a human tendency, let alone an American tendency, is it for us to conclude that with us means win? Like, if you're really in God, how do we tend to, and I don't think this is just an American thing, but it does seem to be an especially American thing, how do we define whether or not you're in God's will? Well, certainly that means the marriage is what you expected. It means the job is fulfilling you in the way that you thought it would. It would mean that you have perfect health, that all of your recreational desires are fully met. What if Mary and Joseph are kind of starting to try to push on a little bit the myth of divine favor in the midst of following God? Or favor, rather, we would say favor that looks outwardly obvious. What if they're exposing, listen, I'm like probably everyone in this room, I'm an American citizen, and quite frankly, I'm proud to be a part of this country. My grandparents, my great-grandparents that I knew personally were German immigrants. It's not lost on me that we're a part of a culture that says if you work hard, then you get hits. If you work hard, then you get the scholarships. That's kind of a part of our human trajectory, and especially our cultural one. What if Mary and Joseph are a warning, though? And you see this come up in Jesus' life, where he's at times kind of needling on people, going, don't assume that just because they're suffering, they're doing it wrong. Richard Rohr, who frankly I don't always identify with, but I guess that's universally true for all of us, hopefully, in terms of you don't always agree with me and blah, blah, blah. But Richard Rohr, I heard him say this week, or heard someone quote him as saying, life is about learning to let go every day. What if part of the Mary and Joseph story is about inviting us to hold in tension the God who says he's with, the God who says, this is what I want for you, with the way that we make sense of and navigate and process circumstances? And see, for me, this brings us back to the original question, does what I do matter? Because what if what Herod's doing is what we might call overcompensating? Like what you feel on a bad day when you wonder, like, is this really moving the needle? God, did you really call me, God, to get that degree and then spend my days changing diapers? Did you really call me, God, to do paperwork because I thought I was going to teach kids? Like, what if Herod knows that tension? And Herod's one way of dealing with the tension. You overcompensate. You build big palaces, literally. You build big religious institutions. The second temple was his baby. The Jews weren't happy with how small it was when it was reconstructed, and Herod said, here, maybe this will earn me your favor. I'll make it opulent and beautiful and massive. And it was in construction in Jesus' day. What if Herod's one way? We overcompensate by trying to in some way ensure that we're irreplaceable. We erect statues, we amass wealth, we do things, we build portfolios in order to somehow numb the pain that we're actually easily replaceable and quickly forgotten. What if Mary and Joseph are an example of the opposite? I mean, question, what else do we know about Joseph? Nothing. Now, is that a sign of insignificance? Or is that actually a picture of what it looks like to live the with God life? That the story's not about us, but God. And that the invitation is, this day does matter. That work you're doing in the lab tomorrow, it does matter. But ultimately, you matter because of whose story you're choosing to tell with your life. That to the extent that you're eternal, it's because he is. What's the story that Matthew is going to tell for the rest of the way? That Jesus is the one. And that he says things like, and when you unite with him, you never taste death. When you follow him, you'll give up everything else in comparison. Does that mean we have to give up everything else? Or are we talking about a story that's so big and so all-encompassing and yet so difficult to stick to that Mary and Joseph serve as a type? A type that every one of us gets to fundamentally make a decision. Are you Herod? And is that how you deal with that tension? Or are you Mary, and maybe even more so Joseph, who faithfully and willfully lives the with God life, and outside of the God of the universe will be forgotten unless, in fact, this story is true, and the kingdom of God is breaking in, and we are building a palace, so to speak, God's recreation, where God puts things back to rights. Listen, I don't know where you're at in your Jesus journey. I don't think any of us are ever at the same place simultaneously. But I do wonder if part of the gift of COVID is this kind of humble recollection of self. Dallas Willard, the way he said, humility is not putting yourself down. Humility is elevating the other. What if the Christian story is ultimately about the elevating of God and his story? Not ultimately concluding you don't matter, but sticking to you matter because of this other who matters way more. And if you're someone trying to make sense of life post-COVID, the invitation that's in front of you is the invitation that's been in front of people for 2,000 years, that you can lose your story in his. And the good news is, it doesn't require some kind of complex religious expression or service. There's not some magical incantation. God speaks every language, even heart language, which means all you have to do to say to God is, I want the with God life. I want the rescue from the cross. And he'll be faithful. And he'll likely say, okay, so now form some friendships around that idea so that you can grow together. So we're going to give you a chance to take communion and just reflect on this new Moses leading the new Exodus into a new life of a different kind of new meaning. Let me pray first. God, thanks that you're king, and that we certainly are not, but we're also not insignificant peons. That, just thinking of David, like how marvelous it is to look at the stars in the sky and see how grand they are, and then reflect on the fact that you say we have more value than them. And yet, God, would we keep the why behind that straight in our heads? That we would be another generation of faithful people who are faithful to whatever it is you call us to for the rest of this day and then again tomorrow, but ultimately know that our significance isn't in that work or any other, but in you and your story and who you are. Amen.
If you would like to learn more about Narrate Church, find us at narratechurch.org or look us up on Facebook and Instagram.